Death is the one certainty we all face as human beings, both for ourselves and our loved ones. Yet we live in a society where we're increasingly sanitised from death. People rarely die at home anymore. Many of us never see a dead body or even an open casket. We no longer bathe the dead and prepare our loved ones for death and burial. And we even use language that disguises death, talking in euphemisms about people crossing over, passing on, and going to sleep. I'm Robyn Whitaker, and today I'm speaking with Brian Macallan, who I'll introduce more fully in a moment, about all these things and more. How do we think about death? What is it? How do we face it well? And what kind of God permits suffering and death? We have this conversation, I'm very conscious, in the midst of Holy Week, the time in the Christian calendar where we face Jesus' death, which we remember tomorrow on Good Friday, death on a cross, and a death that has, in Christian tradition, been interpreted as redemptive, Jesus' suffering as somehow redemptive, which raises a whole other set of questions we might get into about whether our suffering can ever be redemptive. So Brian, I'm delighted to have you here today. Thank you for doing this. Brian is one of the fellows of the Wesley Centre. He's a senior lecturer in theology at the University of Divinity and a Church of Christ minister. He's also an overachiever. Brian holds PhDs in both theology and philosophy, as well as degrees in psychology. He has an interest in the intersection of theology with pain, suffering, and mental health, and has written many books, but one of the most recent is a book titled Forgiving God, Embracing a Risky Adventure with the Divine, which explores, in part, his own experience of facing death. So, Brian, thanks for being here.
Yep, nice to be with you, Robyn.
Let's begin with a little bit about you, including the fact you have an accent. Just tell us where you're from, what you're doing now, and then I'm going to get into the hard stuff.
Awesome. So, you can see the accent is South African. So I've been here for about 17 years now. Originally from Cape Town, and my dad had a video store in the area of Pinelands, which Robyn knows about as well. I have, my wife is a psychologist, and I have two daughters, 19 and 17, which is a fascinating age at the moment for us. Happy to share about that at any time. But so that's a little bit about me and what I'm doing now. I'm studying again, so I'm doing a Master's of Counselling, and I'm exploring some of the connections between faith, therapy, and psychedelics. And I'm a minister at Hartwell Church of Christ, which is in Surrey Hills. I've been there for about a year and a half now.
Great, thank you. And I mean, there's a whole other conversation we might have one day about psychedelics and mental health, but today we're going to focus on other things. You received a pretty bad cancer diagnosis. I don't know if there's ever a good one, but as a young man with a young family, and had to face your own mortality, I think, in a very confronting way at that time. Can you tell us a little bit of that experience and also the other experiences you've had that have kind of, begun to shape the experience, the reflections you've had on facing death?
Paul Tillich said that death, the fear of death, is one of the main drivers of anxiety, and that was certainly the case in my own life. And I think I only realized that when I got my cancer diagnosis, which would have been about 12 years ago. And that came as a surprise. My neighbor had died of cancer, and at his funeral, it was suggested that you should go and everybody should get a colonoscopy. And I was like, what is a colonoscopy? Which I won't go into. But I lied to the doctor and got a colonoscopy, because that's how I got the referral. And when I woke up from the procedure, the doctor was, look, there's a really big tumor in your colon. I was like, huh? What's going on? So that was the journey then. And So yeah, I had an operation that removed 2/3 of my colon, and we're about six months of chemotherapy. And that was my, I referred to my life as BC, like before Christ, that kind of language, but before cancer and after cancer. The other kind of major experiences of death and suffering, because I think they're related. My daughter got Legionnaire's disease, almost died when she was, 2 weeks. She was in intensive care for 6 weeks. I don't think I've even told you that, Robyn. I was there with my dad when he died, which was meaningful but also incredibly difficult. And just recently, I have a friend who has a terminal diagnosis of lung cancer with 2 young kids. And then 2 days ago, you might have seen in the news that little girl, 3-year-old girl that died tragically in Ocean Grove. Her uncle is a good friend of mine as well. So like many of us, we've had our own journeys with death and know people who have died. And so those are kind of the things for me that rumble around when I think of death in my own journey and why I keep thinking about it. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. You had grown up in a Christian home, right? Correct me if any of this is wrong.
Kind of.
You converted to Christianity.
Yeah. When I was
right.
12, I had the full-on Pentecostal conversion. Yep.
Yep. Okay. So at the point at which you got your cancer diagnosis, you were a Christian person, involved in the faith, involved in the church. There's a cluster of questions here. One is about what was the kind of dominant emotion? I mean, in that journey, did you actually think at times you were going to die? And what was the emotion, and how did that relate to your faith? Because there can be a lot of pressure in Christian circles to, just have faith and stay positive and all of that stuff. But I'm not sure that really gets to how people actually feel.
No. For me, I was a minister at that point, and I was lecturing at a small theological college, and the cancer diagnosis for me was the kind of realization that I didn't believe half the things that I thought I believed. And there was this moment of clarity that I'm juggling all these theological balls in the air around faith and life and those kinds of things. And so one of the strange moments of that experience was letting some of that fall to the ground and realizing I didn't understand a lot of the reasons I had for the things that I believed. And that was quite challenging being a minister and just confronting that. It was like I knew those things, but I wasn't brave enough to admit those things. So cancer allowed me to admit those things. If I think of a dominant emotion, though, which is a really good question, I was terrified. I was totally terrified. I had 2 young kids. I remember 2 weeks after the operation when it was clear what the cancer looked like and those kinds of things. And I got the official letter like, oh, okay, so I'm starting chemo. I was like, I mean, I knew that, but so it's like, I'm very careful of my language, sorry. I could die. And I looked at the statistics, and they weren't terrible, but they weren't good in terms of that. And that really sent me down a hole. And I think that began a long process of. Oh, so the other interesting story. I met somebody connected me to someone who was in a similar situation with me. 2 kids, also 2 kids, and had the same cancer as me. His had progressed, and it was a terminal diagnosis, but he believed that God was going to heal him. And I remember having a conversation with him, and he asked me how I'm feeling, and I said, I'm feeling terribly anxious, like, I don't want to die, like, that kind of. And he was like, I really feel sorry for you, was his language, because he believes God's going to heal him, so he doesn't have to worry about that kind of fear. Yeah, so it's an interesting moment in time. But essentially over the next few months, particularly during the chemo, was a wrestle to kind of, how do I actually think about God? How is God involved in this? What does suffering mean? amongst many other things. Sorry, that's a really long response.
No.
Sorry. Yep.
No, that's great. And it takes us into where I do want to go, because, again, in Christian traditions, we have so many different ways of thinking about where God is when we do face illness and suffering and these moments in our life. And one of them is, as you've described, have faith, God will perform the miracle. Raises all sorts of problems in terms of, well, what about the people for whom God doesn't perform the miracle? Is God a fickle God? Lots of problems with thinking in those kinds of ways, and yet I don't want to diminish the place of faith in giving hope. So where did you find God? Was there a sense of God being with you, or did your theology so have to radically shift that there were also times of maybe feeling God wasn't with you? Can you tell us a bit where God was and what you moved from and to? Because I know you have moved in how you think about God as a result of this and other experiences.
Yep.
Big question, sorry.
No. I mean, it's funny, like in terms of the background that I'd come from, which was kind of quite Pentecostal and quite conservative, although I'd moved away from a lot of that. I thought that in that moment I would probably go back to a more conservative space in the way I think about God and life, but I found myself going the other way. And so I kind of got to a point where I was about 6 to 12 months in, where I think I dropped virtually every Christian belief that I had around faith, and I didn't really know who or what I thought about God and God's involvement with my life. And so, yeah, it was a pretty difficult space, actually. I mean, I feel like part of me wants to say there were these moments of peace and sense of oneness with God, but at that moment, it wasn't like that. So those first 12 months was pretty difficult. And from then on, it was a sense of how I want to rebuild or rethink the way I think about God, death, and suffering. Yeah. And initially really challenging, and then I need to rebuild and rethink. And I went mostly to rethinking rather than feeling. Yep.
Yeah, to that. Well, I do want to hear a bit more about that, but I mean, firstly, thank you for being so honest. I know when you're a lecturer, you're a minister, a public Christian of sorts, the pressure to perform a certain kind of faithfulness can also be part of the equation, right?
100%.
So tell me about this rethinking and kind of where you've landed, as much as one can ever land on these questions. I suspect these are lifelong questions, but of what you would now say about God and where God is in things like suffering and death. Or what are just some of the things
Disclaimer, which I give too much, unfortunately. Every time at church on Sunday, they've said they count the disclaimers that I give. And I really do mean this. I think 50% of what I'm going to say now could easily be wrong. It's my own journey, my own story. So just to note that. And I'm constantly changing my mind. And I've noticed that with all my books, and even the recent one I wrote, I've already moved on a whole range of things. So I think it's important to say. So where I got to, and the things that I explored, one of the most influential articles I read, and I did a unit when I was doing my psychology award. I thought I'd fill it with other units, as you do, and so I started filling it with philosophy, and the one unit that really attracted me was called Death and Sex. It's a deacon unit, one of their philosophy units. And one of the articles we had to read was by Hans Jonas, called God After Auschwitz. I don't know if anybody's ever read that one. And that hit me like a ton of bricks, that article. And so Hans Jonas's view was that he didn't feel, in light of the suffering of Auschwitz, and he had lost family members there, that God could be a God who could actually intervene miraculously in life. And so, because his question was then, why, if this is an event that God could do it, this would be a good reason to intervene. Yes. And so, yet, so that was the position he took, but also that God is present in the midst of suffering within that. And so I think if I could simplify the view that I've come to, would probably be along those lines. I'm not convinced that God can intervene, at least in the way that we would want God to intervene in terms of breaking the physical laws of nature to alleviate suffering. So Thomas J. Ord, who writes in that space, recently written a book called God Can't, which I know is a terribly provocative title. So that's the kind of space that I inhabit at the moment. However, I would say my experience over the last 5 years has been a sense of deep connection to God, which I didn't expect, and a sense that one can find a sense of peace, trust in the midst of some of the challenges of life. So a bit of a heady thing on the one hand in terms of philosophically, can God intervene? And the way I think about that, but also a sense that God is still with me in suffering, and I can talk to God about that. You know, like I think it was Elie Wiesel, his story, and I hope this isn't triggering for anyone, but if anybody read the book Night, which is his story in a concentration camp, and he was interviewed by Krista Tippett, and she said, you know, at the end of that book, you said your belief in God went up in flames. And what do you think about that? And he says, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. He said, you Christians are so worried about accusing God of things. I'm just angry at God now. You know, and from that kind of Jewish perspective of God in the dock and being open. So there's been plenty of moments in my own journey with those things of being pretty direct with God. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, being angry with still implies a relationship, right? And a belief.
Yeah.
And often we frame that very differently, and there's judgment around you can't question God or you can't be angry. But actually, if you're angry with God, you're actually engaging God.
Absolutely.
And in really honest kinds of ways, yeah. Yep. Which our tradition doesn't always encourage, I think, or parts of our tradition, should be clear. I'm really conscious that we are having this conversation in the week that Christians remember in particular Jesus' death. And of course, as you know, there are lots of ways Christians have made sense of the death of Jesus. And you know, going back, we had films like Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ that just overemphasised the element of suffering and the horror of that violence. And part of that is because a certain kind of theology has been given that, you know, almost that the more Jesus suffered, the more sign of love it is and the more redemptive it is. So this idea of redemptive suffering. One of my worries with that kind of theology is when it gets taken from Jesus and applied a bit more universally. And I think probably many of us here have heard those stories of like, well, my suffering will somehow bring glory to God, or my suffering can be a witness to this. And there's a real danger we leave people then in places of suffering. So the first question is really, how do we think about things like suffering and pain? Is there a difference between pain and suffering? You know, can they ever be good, useful, redemptive? And then we might get to a whole set of other ethical questions that come out of that. But maybe let's start there. Because in some ways they're unavoidable, right? We will all have some element of them. And what might we say about, yeah.
Yeah. If I try to dodge this question, let me know. I'm noticing a temptation to want to do that. Pain and suffering, I mean, I think as someone who believes that life has evolved through the process of evolution, pain, certainly when you have creatures with nervous systems and things like that, one's experience of pain and suffering has a long history in the evolutionary journey. It's not like when humans arrived, that's the moment where pain and suffering arrive too, depending on how you think of consciousness and other creatures. So, and I mean, linking it back to death in some ways, that's been ingrained in the evolutionary cycle of life. I know some Christians would want to think about that a bit differently. But for me, in terms of taking the science seriously, it's acknowledging that pain and suffering is real. Animals feel pain. Is suffering one's awareness of that pain? And those kind of distinctions. I mean, I think you could tease that out in different ways. I'm a bit nervous around the redemptive suffering bit. It has this kind of, well, that's another thing. Everything happens for a reason. Won't go into that. I'm nervous to say that suffering is redemptive. I think what I would prefer to say is that it might be redemptive for some. And I think that's a very personal awareness, personal perspective that each person has to wrestle with. As someone who's survived my cancer, I can look back at it now and go, there was something about that pain and suffering that has really made me think about life in a way that I would never have thought about it before, and super grateful for that. However, there is forms of pain and suffering around that I'm not convinced can be redemptive in and of themselves. They're just tragic. Yeah. However, I would want to leave that to each individual to kind of work through. I mean, it's interesting when you think of people like Elie Wiesel in the concentration camps, Edith Eger's book, The Choice. I don't know if anybody's ever read that book. It's really worth reading. And then Viktor Frankl. They all speak about how they've used their suffering redemptively and for good. I would never want to say that to anybody that's been in a concentration camp, but that's their journey and their perspective. And so I find that curious. So long way to get to your question, Robyn, is I'm nervous about the way that's used, and let each person figure that out for themselves.
Yeah.
What do you? I don't know. What do you reckon?
I agree, and I think when you and I chatted over coffee, I mean, we acknowledged that, pain and suffering, there's a usefulness to this. Apart from anything else, we need to feel pain to know not to keep our hand in the fire, right? So they have a function, but I think your own experience, the people you're naming, that there is something to say that suffering can be meaningful. I'm trying to be really careful here. For an individual for whom it can be, what they do and think about it afterwards, or even in the moment, can be transformational. I mean, you are not the only person I know who has had a cancer diagnosis and actually radically changed a number of things about their life, right? This is actually quite a common story. It perhaps shakes us out of a certain kind of malaise of just going through the motions. Would you ever wish that on someone? No. Would you want to universalize that? I think, I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that raises for me is the sense of, I think, outside of what suffering and pain does for many of us, and I've chatted to a few people here already and heard a little bit of their stories, is it does make you confront death. And that's something which is really difficult in our society. I know we've spoken about this, sorry if I'm jumping around, no. But I mean, we know Google and all those guys trying to solve the problem of death and spending billions of dollars trying to figure out how we can biologically extend our lives. If anybody's read Yuval Noah Harari's book, Homo Deus, speaks a little bit about that too. And so I'm not sure that we're good for the majority of people of coming to terms with death. So those moments certainly bring those questions to the fore in ways that I think can be redemptive in the terms of the way we want to live our lives.
Yeah. I think what you're raising there around death is fascinating. One of the things I've been reading a lot of in the last couple of years is around AI and digital afterlives is often the language. The fact that, and I see this, my husband's a priest, he'll talk about, sometimes people want to even control not just their death, but what happens after death, and, insist on, you will play this video message from me. So like literally the person from the grave is still speaking via video. I mean, we now have a technology that does all sorts of complex things around keeping people alive. And there can be comfort and connection in that, there can also be a death-denying, really unhelpful aspect of that, I think. One of the things I noticed when I was in ministry too was the trend to no longer have coffins in churches, to no longer want to lower coffins into graves. And I had a funeral director say, we don't do that anymore because it's too confronting for people. I'm like, letting it hover on the surface is not in any way making this death less harmful, you know. But so when we think about death, and you are someone I know who's thought about it a lot, what is it? And I didn't prep you for this question, but let's just go there. How do we think about death, and how do we think about afterlife, which of course there's very different ideas about depending what faith you are or whether you have faith or no faith. But did you come to any kind of new conclusions about so-called heaven, resurrection, any of those things that impact how you think about death?
Yes, and probably quite recently, actually. So that's quite interesting. Yes, so many things I can say about this. I can tell you what I feel about that now, for a range of different reasons, kind of philosophically and theologically, which I won't go into. I'll just tell you what I think. But for me, I believe that there is some form of continuation once we die. What that exactly looks like, I don't know. So I think some people can be, sometimes the critique of religious and spiritual traditions is that having a belief in an afterlife will pull you away from engagement with this life. The kind of religion is the opiate of the people, it's just about escaping this world to get to another one. And I hear that, and I think that's a fair critique in some ways. However, I think the belief that there is something beyond our current existence into the future can also be comforting. So, and not to get too much into psychedelics, but part of that is a lot what's happened at St. Vincent's Hospital when they've done psychedelics for people with terminally ill cancer patients, is it's enabled them to believe that there is something more that's coming, and it's been able them to engage with their loved ones in different ways that does alleviate some of the anxiety. So I'm getting all over the place, but yes, I believe there is some form of existence. However, I'm cautious around that distracting us from making a difference here, but also realizing that it can bring some level of comfort to others. So yeah, feel free to probe that, but that's kind of...
No,
yeah.
Well, maybe another way to ask this is to flip the question, which is, in facing your own death and thinking about death, what does it actually help you learn about life? Or what has it changed in terms of the way you think you individually and we as human beings should think about what's important in life?
So I'm a pretty intense human being, and so when I make decisions, I move pretty quickly. I think when I was fearing death, fearing leaving my kids behind, it's one of those moments where you get a real sense of clarity of what's important. I don't know if anybody's seen the Matrix movie, that moment where it's I forget who it is frozen in air, Trinity I think it is, and sees everything really slow down, and the sense of clarity. I felt like I got that for the first few months. I've lost that a little bit. But for me, that was realizing the importance of relationships in my life, and the importance of my health. So I changed a lot around my diet for a whole bunch of different reasons. I've relived retirement in reverse in some ways. Instead of waiting to travel when I'm late, I thought, I want to see the world. I don't know how long I've got. So my mortgage wasn't very happy with me. But we've certainly seen the world a lot in the last 10 years. So it's, the real importance of family, being present to kids, health. We sold our home, moved into the hills. I wanted to stop getting out of my workaholic craziness that I was involved in. So I changed a lot, but I noticed the further away I've got from my cancer journey, I've lost a little bit of the impetus to stick with that, and kind of cultural and personal habits keep creeping back in. Yeah. Is that what you mean, Robyn?
Yeah. No, thank you. That's helpful. I mean, and that is the kind of wake-up call these things can be, right? In terms of actually helping us realise what's important or what really matters in the daily churn of life that can actually be pretty distracting to all of that. Yeah. I want to turn now to thinking about our kind of obligation to others and the impact of what we might believe about suffering and death, whatever that is, how that actually does have an impact on others, whether it's actually in our policies around palliative care, what we think about things like voluntary assisted dying, what we think about our obligation is to actually alleviate other people's pain and suffering. So I think we've both named in different ways the kind of worst examples of a kind of Christian theology that says, well, we'll all go to heaven one day or whatever, so God will make it all right, therefore we do nothing now. What do you think, out of your own experience and then working as a minister, what do you think our obligation is to others in terms of both alleviating pain and suffering, and it's a slightly different question, journeying with them in facing death? Like, how can we do those things well, and what do we need to be thinking about?
Wow. I think there's people in this room that know a whole lot more about that than I do, so I'm curious in hearing your thoughts on that. But so I personally am in support of voluntary assisted dying and the legislation that's here, and so and my general desire is to, as much as we can, to alleviate suffering for others, whatever that looks like, whether that's human beings, whether that's creatures. In my home, I'm pretty careful not to kill things that I don't need to, because I think all life is sacred and precious. And so my mode of being in the world, and in terms of the impact maybe legally in society, is to do the utmost that we can to alleviate suffering and pain, realizing that can't always be the case, and that for some people that suffering and pain is too much, and I would support them in terms of voluntary assisted dying, and going through the legal processes. That sounded a bit clinical. I hope it didn't come across that way. In terms of caring for people, everyone's different. That would be my sense as somebody who's been in ministry and been with people who have died, is there's no one way of walking alongside people. For me, this is my experience, is to be deeply present with people and see what emerges in that space. For me, it's an awareness of the divine in that space, but I appreciate people have different views on that. Journeying with people as my friend, having a coffee, every week, and this week he feels terrible, next week he's feeling optimistic, and just being there for the journey and the ups and downs of that experience. A deep sense of presence, being with people, but realizing that their situation is unique, and their cultural backgrounds and spiritual care, those who study in that space, with cultural and religious backgrounds, how important that is in terms of frames our engagement with people, rather than bringing in our own particular ideologies and perspectives.
Yeah. When you were going through your cancer treatment, what would have helped you, or, without naming names, maybe what was the least helpful thing? And what was the helpful thing? Was it, and part of what you just said, was it people actually giving you permission to be honest about what was going on, actually being prepared to use the language of death? Would that have been too much for you? Tell us a bit about what helps and hinders.
Yeah, so that, I suppose, again, the personal dynamic of that, I'm the kind of person who's just, okay, I'm going to accept this. I'm not, the stages of grief that people go through, denial. There was no denial. I was like, okay, I could die, and I want to just try and figure out what that means. What was curious for me is how many of my friends fell off for various reasons. Some, for theological reasons, were unhappy with the way I was thinking about God and life. For others, the reality of me potentially dying was just too much. And so there was that sort of sense. When I look back as people saying they think necessarily anything that was unhelpful, I think what was helpful for me is somebody just being willing to be with me and listen to me. And the kind of theological, physical, emotional, and mental ups and downs that was pretty tricky. I started seeing a psychologist at that point. And I'm still seeing that psychologist today. So, and that was a particularly helpful thing for me. So, yeah, a sense of just being with me, allowing me to be myself. But yeah, nothing particularly unhelpful that I can reflect back on. Yeah, yep.
Thank you. In a moment, we're going to open this up for some questions from all of you. I know there's people in the room that will have your own personal experiences that might be similar to Brian's. There's some of you who work in palliative care and those kind of spaces. I will ask that you keep your questions short, please. And while I appreciate there's lots of stories in the room, this is not perhaps the place to share a long story about yourself. But before we do that, so you can start to think about your questions, is there anything else we haven't talked about that you feel is important to say?
I suppose something that I've done in my whole life is to the last 10 years since cancer, is to try and keep death close to me. I know the Renaissance, a lot of the Renaissance philosophers, they used to have a skull on their desk, and that would remind them of their mortality. It's illegal to traffic in human remains, so don't do that if you're thinking about doing that. But I do that. I remind myself every day that I could die today, and I could lose people who are close to me today, and that brings me back into the moment, helps me to be more authentic with who I am, more authentic with other human beings. And at this moment in time, seeing death and darkness is not necessarily an evil or a bad thing. It's a transforming thing for me. It's a transformational space into something else. Good Friday, you don't get many people at church on a Good Friday. Everybody comes on Sunday. I see people smiling, drops off already.
Sunday's the happy day.
Yeah, weird name, hey, Good Friday. So that would be something that I've continually tried to do. I'm not always particularly good at it, but I think it does help me re-engage with who I am and re-engage with others around me in a meaningful way. Yeah. So rather than running away from it, as ACT or acceptance commitment therapy would say, accepting it for what it is.
Can I ask what that actually looks like, that daily reminder? If it's not a skull on the desk, is this something you do in a meditation or a prayer or a...
I'm a bit nervous to admit the next one.
Is there a poster on the wall?
So I used to drink way too much. That was a problem as well that cancer's helped me work through. But I used to have a vodka jar with a skull. And so it hasn't got vodka in it anymore, it's got water. So I have that at the top. My eldest daughter has found out that it doesn't have vodka, and she's tried it without me knowing. So it's a small thing. I mean, a bit silly, but every day when I get up, when I put my feet on the bed, get off the bed, I say a few mantras or things, and I say to myself, "This could be my last day." So it's just a small reminder in that moment. And then throughout the day, reminding myself that life is suffering, the first truth of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, and accepting that. And so reminding myself throughout the day that that's the case. So those are two small things, I think. I'm sure there's hundreds of others, but yeah.
No, thank you. For me, one of the my favourite Christian services is Ash Wednesday, when you actually get the ash put on your head. And again, not always a full church for that. And you get reminded, you are dust, to dust you shall return. It's a very confronting reminder of our mortality at that moment.
and we did that for the first time at church this year, so people could come up and I would put an ash cross on their head. But what was really difficult is my daughter started coming to church, and she's not a Christian, and she came up.
Ooh.
And it was this moment of just, oh my gosh, she almost died. We were, I didn't go into the whole story, but the doctor said that we should come and say goodbye to her. That's how close it was. So I was just totally overcome. It's my daughter coming to put, but I did it, and so Ash Wednesday, that does bring it home to us. And I think the beauty of the Christian tradition, amongst other religious and spiritual traditions, is it does bring those things to the surface in a way that sometimes our culture is not particularly interested in engaging with.
Yeah, thank you. So are there any questions? We have the wonderful Alice who'll run around with a microphone.
Thank you. My name's Imelda, and this is my first time here actually, so this is very interesting. Thank you. You mentioned a falling away of your beliefs during that time, and I'm wondering, is that a crisis of faith or a death and resurrection of your faith, if you will? Or is it a period of lamentation? Lamentation, we were, being angry with God. And the second part of my question is, how did you then find your way back? And it might be in your book. Feel free to tell me to just read your book. But, how did you find your way back to forgiving God?
Yeah, that's a great question. Crisis of faith is probably one way to describe that. I literally remember this dark sense of, okay, I'm not sure God exists, not sure what I think about Jesus, and I think when I die, that's the end. And it was a terrible hole and depressive space for me for a long time. And then what I normally do is try to solve problems in my head, so read enormously around a whole bunch of different things. And found a way of thinking about God from a process theological perspective within the Christian tradition that still sees God as close, but believes that God has less control over the future and this current moment than the kind of majority perspective within Christianity would allow. So that was a kind of rethinking in my space. Okay, there's actually other ways I can think about this. And again, I appreciate that most people might find that a bit challenging, but and there was a second part to your question, I think, was it? Lamentation. I think there wasn't so much a lamentation as much as I just let it all go. Let it all go. Oh, how did I rebuild it? Yeah, so there was the thinking, but I would say in the last 5 years, through a range of different things, that's a bit vague, I've come to experience God in some interesting ways that has led me back to a more of an experiential relationship with God. So I did a lot of thinking initially, but I'd say in the last 3 to 5 years, I've become more open to a potential encounter with the divine and what that might look like. In a way that I'm still trying to figure out. So initially the head, trying to think through different options, but I'm not sure how much of that dropped to my heart. And I think returning to church, I went away from church for a long time, engaging with religious and spiritual practices have all been really helpful for me. Is that all right? I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brian and Robyn, for the conversation. My name is Jess. I was really helped by some of the individual spiritual practices or practices that you offered to keep death close. And it turned my mind to how would we keep death close communally? What does it look like in our churches, but even in our broader communities, our public institutions, schools, workplaces? I'm not expecting that you have detailed answers for all of these things, but I wonder if you could offer us something from your clearly deep reflection in this way about keeping death close in some of those communal spaces.
I mean, for me, the first space, I suppose my headspace goes to is the church. I mean, 'cause that's mostly what I'm familiar with. I have come from a tradition historically which is Pentecostal charismatic. Doesn't like death so much, doesn't like suffering so much, and if you have it, it's a problem that you need to be healed from. Sorry to be, I shouldn't have said it quite like that, sorry. That was my experience in the particular Pentecostal circumstance that I was in, right? And so, health, wealth, gospel, that stuff, which is mirrored in a lot of society stuff as well. My recent experience with church over the last few years is a return to more the liturgical ways of engaging with faith and practice, the Christian calendar and things like that, which do bring those things to the surface. So Ash Wednesday as an example, the Lent journey, Good Friday, amongst other things, the stories of the saints. So as a church, we try to speak about those things as much as we can. And we're quite happy to bring in other religious traditions and perspectives, and I think Buddhism is particularly good with that from our perspective. If we've got a Buddhist in our church, he really helps with that. In terms of the wider society and things like that, in terms of bringing it more to the center, I feel a bit stumped. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts, Robyn, yeah, I mean, I suppose you go back 100 years, most people would bury 70% of their children. I think it was Tolstoy lost 7 out of 9. And so death was so much part of the cultural milieu and whether the grieving was better or not, I don't know. But there was certainly something about death being part of everyone's lives, and that's not so much the case today. How we provide spaces to think about that culturally, I'm not sure. I mean, the deacon unit, death and sex is an interesting way to get people thinking about it. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Robyn, or others that might want to respond to that, but yeah.
One of the things I've been learning about through my sister, who I don't think is here, otherwise she could say this, she's been exploring a lot of like death doula, this sort of spiritual training of death walking, and which I must say as a Christian I sometimes do just roll my eyes at and go, what are you talking about? But trying to be open. But it's probably a very minority movement, but there are people out there now thinking about very practical things, like you can have a kind of a bed that literally has an ice blanket so that you could have a body in your home. So going back, when someone died at home, and Jews still do this kind of sitting shiva, you sit with the body and you mourn together and you actually spend time with the deceased. We now have sanitized that. The funeral home takes the person away. It's all done behind closed doors. We don't often engage. And there are these alternative things emerging that I think might be a way that perhaps even Christian traditions can learn from, about the way that we can re-engage more deeply with the body. And I mean, when I've trained students with funerals and things, one of the things I'll tell them is go touch the coffin. There's a person in there. There's a human being in there. And even we in the church can be a bit sanitized about that person's gone now, but that's a loved person in the room,
As you were talking about that, Robyn, my experience with my dad came to mind, and I noticed myself getting a little bit emotional, but it was it's so vivid and so meaningful. The whole family was with my dad when he had his last breath, and I appreciate not everybody gets that. And my mom's minister came around, and we sat around the body for an hour. And spoke about Dad and what that meant, and very powerful experience. Sorry, I'm just riffing off what you said, and grateful for that.
Yeah, and a lot of hospitals will still allow this, and palliative, right? The time to actually. I did a brief stint at Peter Mac, and I was really impressed. The nurses would say to the family, "You sit in this room with this now dead person as long as you need to. And that can be a really powerful moment for a family to do that. Are there other questions?
Thanks, my name is David. Starting at the policy end, we have voluntary assisted dying, we have palliative care, or we have the hospital do whatever you can to keep them alive. And we've heard a lot today reflecting our society with a focus on the individual. But for many people, not all, many, they're surrounded by a family who are part of those decisions as well. So stepping back to theology, where's the role for faith in supporting the family around a person leading up to and then after? And how would that then support them at that policy decision end?
Yeah, great question. Again, for me, I go back to probably each family situation is unique. Whether that person wants their families involved in those decisions is an interesting question. I would hope, well, I can speak as a minister, that would want to engage with the family as individuals within that process as well, if they're part of the church, around how they're feeling and thinking about how to think about that. And then collectively, to the extent that they would be willing to do that. So I suppose it's just a detailed engagement with that family in terms of their unique context and their willingness to engage around those kinds of questions. So again, a kind of gestalt presence and seeing what emerges from that space. But also doing the best I can to make available the kind of legal process and procedures and what that looks like, which is difficult, and some people in the family might find that difficult. And then, post that conversation, what is the level of care that I can offer as a minister, but also noting that for many family members, making referrals available to psychologists and to other carers and counsellors in terms of grief that can help them with that process. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's kind of the way I would think about it in terms of engaging with the family in our church, at least. Yeah.
I think one of the things that spiritual carers and faith leaders can do is actually speak truth, kindly, but to actually be in these spaces and say, your mom is dying, and this is what actually happens when someone's dying. You know, their breath will slow down, they might feel cold. They can probably still hear you even if they can't respond, like really practical stuff, but also not being afraid of using words like dying. And would you like me to say a prayer with whatever the space is? When I was in congregational ministry and we had a nursing home in our place, I would often get called in at the point of death. There were several times I would literally be praying and the person would die when I prayed. It made me a bit nervous to actually pray for people. But there's something about naming what is going on, I think, and a combination of both the practical and the freedom to... Because families often... If you've never been with a dying body, a dying person, I think, a lot of us are facing that for the first time when it's someone we love and emotions are all over the place, right? So just the very calm, I don't know. But David, I want to hear from you what you would say.
No, I don't want to take from other people asking questions, but also the role for the faith within the family. Like we've heard a lot about the individual experience, but that tumult around faith sustaining everyone.
Yeah, I suppose I go two spaces where that depends on the faith of that family and what that looks like, and noting that the family doesn't have a faith. They probably some might have different faiths, no faiths, and trying to be sensitive to that and to how that functions. So certainly, absolutely trying to pay attention to that. And, talking about recently one of the older folk in our congregation died, and I was there with her, and her family was around, and they do come from a Christian faith background, and it's honouring in that moment, sitting with the family, praying with them, and saying goodbye together, and so absolutely bringing faith into that space. But again, being sensitive, if you're with a family that has no belief around some of those things, I wouldn't do that. Yeah, so it's very context based for me.
Brian, I just want to thank you both for your just honesty and sharing your own story, for the huge amount of work and reflection you've done, both intellectually and spiritually, in thinking about death and, of course, life when we face death. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation today. And as a minister who works in a church, and this is a rather busy week of the Christian year, so thank you too for being
Thank
here.
you. Thanks, Jewel.
Can we thank Brian? Thank you. Next month, we pivot to a very different topic. We're going to have Wesley Centre, former Human Rights Commissioner, coming and talking about AI and human rights. So we'd love to see you here if you'd like to come back on the third Thursday in May.